Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Neil Chase. I'm the CEO here at CalMatters. I appreciate everybody coming in person and the several hundred people we have with us online as well for a really important conversation. Very happy to be able to host these kinds of conversations. We call this live journalism, right? This is us doing our job of exploring, understanding, explaining, investigating, and doing it in person where we can have a kind of a real-time conversation with the folks on the panel and with you about what's going on. I want to especially thank our sponsors, Lucas Public Affairs. They are great partners of ours and longtime partners of ours since the start, and very helpful in putting this on and making this possible and making lunch possible. So enjoy lunch for those of you here in the room, and sorry for those who are virtual that we don't have lunch delivered to your house, maybe next time. We're talking about a very important topic today, and one that I think a lot of folks know a little bit about, and probably not enough people know enough about, and so we're especially pleased to be able to dig in and explain more today. Our reporter who's leading this, Miranda Lyons, comes to us by way of places many of us in California don't come from, like Arkansas and Montana, and she has reported on a lot of different things in different places. Came to us as a video journalist to start with, and she's one of those, Swiss Army knife, multimedia, multi-skilled kinds of people. She's a data journalist. She's an investigative journalist. She's a criminal justice journalist. She's a video journalist. I'm sure I'm leaving some things out, but that's enough for one day. I don't want to get her too excited here. But we're going to have a fascinating conversation. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to Miranda, and off we go.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us in person and on Zoom for this conversation about California's bet on rehabilitation over incarceration. This will be an hour-long discussion, so we'll try to keep things on time and on target. And it's a heavy topic. So, please be respectful of people's opinions, which may vary, which likely will vary. We're not all the same person, so we all think about things differently. And that's what makes this discussion great. I will go through what we'll cover. So first, we'll define rehabilitation, and the panelists will use their myriad experiences to define what rehab looks like. And we'll answer if our definition matches reality. I want us to understand what the state is doing currently and what we can improve upon. And finally, we'll discuss the future of rehab, whatever that looks like. And we will leave time at the end for question and answer. We have received I think dozens of questions. So we have more than enough questions. However, if you have something that's pressing, you can always raise your hand and we will address you. So first, without any further delay, let me introduce our panelists. We have Colette Carroll. Colette is the president and executive director and co-founder of California Reentry Institute. She serves those incarcerated in and released from San Quentin State Prison. We have Jesse Vasquez. Jesse serves as executive director for the Friends of San Quentin. Jesse is formerly incarcerated after serving 19 years for multiple life sentences. We also have Dr. Kimberly Richmond. Dr. Richmond is the chair of the sociology department at the University of San Francisco. She also co-founded a social justice and reentry nonprofit in San Francisco. And last but certainly not least, we have Orlando Sanchez Zavala. Orlando is a fiscal and policy analyst with California's Legislative Analyst's Office. He gives the state legislature nonpartisan, that's key, nonpartisan analysis and recommendations on issues regarding prison rehabilitation programs. Welcome. So for about a year, I have been reporting and learning, that's key, learning, about reentry programming, which has become a significant part of California's strategies to shift towards rehabilitation and less incarceration. My work has focused on the state's largest parolee reentry program called Specialized Treatment for Optimized Programming, also known as STOP. I found that the state really doesn't do a good job of tracking results or managing this very sprawling program. How many of you are familiar with that story? Show of hands. Oh, wow. Good. If you haven't read it, there's a link on our website, so you'll be able to find it. But before we get started, by a show of hands, how many people think they know what rehabilitation means from a state perspective? Raise them high. Don't be bashful. Okay. All right. And remember if you raised your hand or not, because I'm going to ask that question at the end of the discussion. So let's get started. My first question is for Dr. Richmond. Will you please define rehabilitation?
So I teach about this, and the definition that I typically use, although I ask my students to poke holes in it and question it, is that rehabilitation is a fundamental and lasting behavior change away from harmful behavior that often includes, but is not fully dependent on, attitudinal change. And let me just explain that for a second. What I mean by that is sometimes some attitudes can be rechanneled in pro-social ways. So it doesn't necessarily change doesn't have to change who a person is. It has to change how their behaviors manifest.
And Colette and Orlando, what do you think about that definition?
A little clinical, perhaps. On the ground, rehabilitation to me and our organization means helping somebody heal from the traumas of their life and finding out the causative factors of why they stopped being their authentic self and ended up in blue and incarcerated.
Orlando?
Yeah, and how we think about it is associated with how it's measured. So typically, changing someone's behavior is an important key because that...
Orlando, can you put your mic up to your mouth?
Sorry?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So it's how you measure rehabilitation is a key way in defining it. So one perspective is reducing people's ability of criminal offending that might be likely after being released from prison. That's like one perspective. Also another one is, are people getting provided with the needs that they have that led them to incarceration? So for example, some people enter the prison system with a history of substance abuse, so providing programming that's consistent with that need is also a way for someone to move towards progressing towards that rehabilitation. And we've also seen other definitions researchers provide that move beyond recidivism and thinking about it, and those are important to highlight as well, is not only are people returning back to prison, but also are people committing fewer crimes or committing crimes that are less serious that led them. So those are some ways we broadly think about it.
And Jesse, from your life experience, how are these definitions resonating with you?
I find them fairly interesting, and I think it just resonates with like how we've been defining things historically. I think the definition of rehabilitation is kind of like any definition in the Webster's dictionary, where it has number 1, 2, 3, and 4, where it has multifaceted definitions, and it's not just one thing. And unfortunately, the way that we've come to define rehabilitation, it's about programming and then outcomes, and that's not the way that like we actually experience rehabilitation. Rehabilitation for us, in terms of like programming and personal growth, it's a holistic approach to the individual. You can't just give me academics without giving me pro-social opportunity to develop. You can't give me academics and vocational training without giving me also an opportunity to actually have a pathway into employment that's feasible. So there's a lot of barriers, right, when it comes to me being rehabilitated. And on top of that, right, let's just say that the only people that are expected to be rehabilitated are the incarcerated, as if society doesn't need to be rehabilitated in and of itself. There are some people that have a lot of road rage, and I'm wondering, like, ooh, I got anger management for you. So that's just, a little bit.
Now, hearing all these definitions, how would any of you change your perspective or how you defined rehabilitation?
I just want to add something to mine, which Jesse was right on point with two things. Number one, the reason it's open-ended in my definition is because people in prison aren't the only people who need to or do rehabilitate, right? So it has to be a little more broadly than that. There are plenty of social ills that people need to rehabilitate from who didn't end up in prison, right? Exactly as you were pointing out, whether it's anger or trauma or anything else. The second piece of that is when I interviewed people for my research who are incarcerated, not in California, but in Ohio, they focused on change and opportunity, right? So that opportunity piece is part of what you're speaking about too, right? They focused either on change of mindset, a new outlook, embracing newness in some way, something new, and others emphasized the really material. We need to get a job. We need to be prepared to get a job and live our life, basically.
And Orlando, you mentioned something that I thought was interesting, that people are using, or there's an attempt to look beyond recidivism to define rehabilitation. Can you talk a little bit about that? And will you hold your mic closer?
Happy to. Oh, yeah, happy to. So we...
Closer. There we go.
Okay, yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, sorry.
We just want to make sure people on Zoom can hear.
Yeah, great. So some researchers have started, as a form of rehabilitation is, one way is also like, are people self-sufficient? Can they re-enter society? And like some of these, and a community with the skills, the tool set that they need to thrive in there. So do they have the employment abilities? Do they have, as mentioned, like anger management or some other forms? But also there's the movement, also some academic researchers have called this desistance from crime, so people committing fewer crimes, not just recidivism only captures, did you commit a crime, yes or no? In this case, it's adding to it, did you commit a serious crime again, or a violent crime, or is it more of a as additional ways to see people's journey through that process, and it's not a binary in that sense.
Colette, I want to come back to you. Did any of this discussion change or alter how you define rehabilitation?
I think I should probably expand on what I said, only because my philosophy and everything I've studied over the last 23 years of doing this work, and prior to doing it, we talk about change a lot. But change is external. For us, we talk about transformation. Transformation is internal. Our philosophy is we have to help somebody transform the inside. They have to heal. In my 23 years, I've heard the most horrific circumstances in people's lives and why they are actually walk down that path to incarceration. And so until they can care about themselves, feel like they've got self-worth and self-value, people cannot care about people outside. People turn around and say, well, they don't care about me, why should I care? Our job is to help them care about themselves, then to empower them to understand the harm that they have caused and the pain they've caused through victims and surrogate victims and survivors, and then to realize that it can be different, that they aren't what they did. Our first day in class, I want you to repeat after me, I am not my crime, because society has labeled them as what they've done. And a lot of them have had that label their whole life. You're worthless, you're useless, I wish you were never born, I hate you. You go on and on and on and on. We've got to help them understand they have some self-worth. And once you give somebody self-worth, they will be different.
Now, I want to move on a little bit to how the state defines rehabilitation, and we're going to get there by talking about recidivism. I do want to note that we did invite the Department of Corrections to come to participate, and they declined. But that's just for transparency, so you all will know who we invited. So recidivism by the state's definition occurs when someone is convicted of a new felony or misdemeanor within 3 years of being released from custody or placed on supervision for a previous criminal conviction. For years, the recidivism rate has hovered around 46%. So I want to ask this question, and I'm going to start at the other end. When it comes to measuring the success of rehabilitation programs, what are the metrics
And so some key metrics that, recidivism is one that the state closely looks to as a key metric for measuring whether it's succeeding. Another one is the department in 2012 set the goal that people will be assessed for the needs, or it's called criminogenic needs. So these are things that led someone or that are associated with a crime. So people are assessed of that need. So the department set the goal of 70% of people entering prison receiving programming consistent with that need. So those are two key metrics that we could look to recidivism, and whether the department that set that goal are kind of important to factor in.
Dr. Richmond?
Sorry, the question was how the state...
when it comes to measuring the success of rehabilitation programs.
Yeah, so I think it's problematic to use recidivism as it's defined, and I would point to the mission of the CDCR as printed on their website, which I copied down so you could hear it, to facilitate the successful reintegration of the individuals back into their communities, equipped with tools to be drug-free, healthy, and employable members of society, all in a safe and humane environment. It never says recidivism, right? And yet we have this very simplistic measure. Does a person get convicted for a new crime? And by the way, that's changed over time. They used to measure 5 years, right, and then they started measuring 3 years. At one point, it was return to prison rates. Now it's conviction rates. There was a period of time where they included technical violations on parole, which were not new crimes. And so we have to be really careful about looking at recidivism rates, because it can mean different things in different places. And I think there's a bigger picture here, which the department is right about. It's not just about, did you get convicted of a crime? It's how are you doing, right? How integrated are you in the community? Do you have a job? Do you have a social support network? Things like that.
Yeah, and to that point, I will say that was one of the challenges with my reporting, is that the state wasn't tracking if people got a job or if people were, doing well in terms. They didn't track if they got a job or even if they returned back to prison. From your vantage point, Jesse, how should we be measuring success?
I think so. Let me just point out a couple of things, right, that I have with the recidivism thing. And recidivism only looks at the individual, if we're going to talk about that. But recidivism rates, they get projected out, 5, 10, 15, 30 years. The Department of Justice can predict, how many people are going to be incarcerated in 10 years. The Department of Corrections issues a report every 2 years that they say, hey, we predict that this is going to be the recidivism rate in the next 3 to 5 years. So if you can predict that, that means that you know the precursors that lead to that recidivism rate. So why are you not addressing those precursors? Why are you not filling those gaps? Whether it's employment, whether it's, let's say affordability, skill sets. It's not just about the individual. Individuals that parole, for instance, recidivism rates are high within the first year or the first year and a half of parole. If you parole today, unless you parole to a community-based organization that has their own facility with their own wraparound services in a good neighborhood, guess what? There are city and county laws that legally say you can't have a reentry center here. You can't have a transitional housing here. You can only put it in the ghetto. And excuse my language, right? But they want you to be in an environment where it's high crime rates, high drug addiction, high prostitution. The best program that they have, in Oakland right now, right? And I'm using this loosely, right? That the department paroles people to is the Dream Center. The Dream Center is on 23rd and International. You can drive by there any night after 4:30, 5 o'clock, and you'll see sex workers walking up and down the street. You'll see drug dealing happening up and down 23rd, 22nd, and off on San Leandro. Is that an environment conducive towards reentry? Is that a safe environment? You have programs that push people beyond their stress factor. They come home after 40 years incarcerated, having done all the programs in the world inside of prison. They came out saints. They didn't come out model citizens, but you're going to send them to a program that has a blackout period of 60 days. people are going to stress out because they can't be in touch with their loved ones. They can't do anything. So there's a lot of social factors, legal factors, administrative factors, and laws that bar us from actually having equal access to a beneficial life. So it's not just about the individuals finding a way to go back into drugs. There's precursors to that. So I think when we look at the recidivism rates, it's not just about the individuals that are going back. It's what are the social conditions that are allowing that to happen? Because we're failing them as a society.
Colette, do you have anything to add?
A lot.
Okay.
We could be here for hours. To what everybody has said, the reality is preparing somebody prior to release, giving them the empowerment to succeed, we found successful, right? In our case. But it must be followed by the services that Jesse's talking about. It must be followed by assistance getting employment, the ABCs, any job, better job, career, to get your self-esteem to continue while you're in society. It has to be a safe place to be. The Dream Center, if people are already transformed, I've had many people go to the Dream Center and it has worked for them, but they have us as support alongside what's happening there. So everything that Jesse said is absolutely true. And as to recidivism, people can falter. But the question is, if you've got a good program and a good relationship with paroles, they don't go back to prison. You help them recover from whatever it was. If it's not egregious, like a new crime. Let's say somebody has a dirty test, right? You don't violate them immediately and send them back. You help them recover and get back on the path.
So one of the things that I learned from Orlando was about program fidelity. How are programs being implemented? So oftentimes you'll see things that say, this is an evidence-based program. And evidence-based, is it evidence-based, but how the evidence is based on it being implemented in a certain way. Jesse, can you talk a little bit about program fidelity and how or what the state is doing to look at programs and analyze them?
Me?
Oh, I'm sorry, Jesse. I'm looking at Orlando and saying,
Jesse. About the state.
Lord. Orlando.
Yeah, happy to. So I guess, kind of giving a little bit more detail on what Rhonda just elaborated on. It's not enough. Academic researchers have tried to figure out what the main metric has been recidivism. They looked at what leads to people committing less crime, and there's been some rigorous research done that shows these specific programs, if they're targeted to specific people, can have X and Y such outcomes, right? But it's not enough to call a program by the same name if you're not using the same curriculum, you're not using the same pieces of information, the same instructional materials, having the trained staff to operate it in the same way that research showed. So there's fidelity assessments to try and get at that, see if your program is following that same research that had showed that it worked. And what we know as of now is that the department this is something that came up in a recommendation we provided in previous work, that the department should start moving towards providing those fidelity assessments. The best thing ideally would be to test each individual program and see whether it's working or not, and that's like the ideal scenario. The second best thing is, if you're not, are you using programs that have been shown elsewhere to work? And one way to get at that is fidelity assessments, and that's, again, in some ways going through and finding whether they're being implemented as the research showed worked, and are they targeting the right population, curriculum, et cetera. And that was a recommendation we had several years ago, and the department in 2019 indicated after an audit from the auditor's office that they did start implementing them, but we haven't heard what the outcome of those fidelity assessments have been.
I want to switch gears here. I know we've kind of gone into detail about programming, but I really think it's important when you see evidence-based, and it was a learning experience for me because I see evidence-based, I'm like, oh, this works. But those fidelity reports are really important to understand how programs are being implemented. But let's talk a little bit about the San Quentin model. Jesse is on the committee that is helping design the California way, the new model. And I want to ask, is the San Quentin model, how many of you have heard of it? Oh, great. So basically transforming San Quentin into a rehabilitation prison. Just what's your take on the new model? And is it viable for the future?
So I will say I'm not the model from San Quentin. That's number one. So let me preface what I'm about to say with a couple things. Number one, the title of this panel today, California's bet on rehabilitation, assumes that it's a 50-50 shot. And when we start thinking that way, right, we're already on the deficit mindset. We don't see it as an investment. And that's been part of the problem with the Department of Corrections and society as a whole, where we see investment in human beings and rehabilitation as an issue. So this is the first time ever that there's ever going to be a governor, a state, a department that's going to take a chance on saying, hey, we want to solidify rehabilitation as not just a slogan, but we want to have an institution, we want to have a vocational center, we want to have an education center, we want to have a restorative justice center. We want to have something that we can actually look to as, our guiding star. Now, it's for sure, huge risk politically. But I give the department and the governor a lot of grace because they're taking a chance on something that the country has never done. Incarceration for the past 170 years has been about lock them up and throw away the key. We've had systems that have failed for decade upon decade upon decade that are too big to fail, and we keep funding. This is the first time ever that we're finally taking a chance on, let's invest in the people inside, let's invest in community-based organizations, let's set something up that we can point to and say, you know what, this is what we're aiming for. Now, is it going to work? We don't know yet. But guess what? If you don't give it enough time, you're not going to know. We don't have enough data yet. We haven't even gotten there, and there's already so much criticism in the space that it's like kind of discouraging for the incarcerated to hear that, hey, society doesn't care. They don't want to fund this. They don't want to support this. They don't believe in having more prisons beautified. And they're not thinking about how much more programming we'll be able to have. Now, granted.
So, Jesse, I hate to cut you off, but I do want to, we're going on time. And Dr. Richmond, I want to add you to this question. How optimistic are you that the new San Quentin model will significantly change how rehabilitation is delivered in prisons?
So when I've read the model, which is actually the Scandinavian model, it's based on prisons in Norway and Denmark and so forth, I had two thoughts. One is we live in a very different environment, and we don't have the same social support and social welfare state that they do there. And two was is changing San Quentin. I mean, I had a ton of questions. It raised questions for me, right? So is changing San Quentin going to change the culture of incarceration, which is fundamentally in the U.S., but also other places, about dehumanization, about taking away autonomy and self-sufficiency, and about removal and isolation. Is all of that going to change, right? Are they going to get rid of the numbers, call people by their first name? The other thing is that there's a lot of good research from criminologists coming out of the Norway model and showing that, there are some important facets of incarceration that are still there, right? They still have to control people. It's still lonely. So I have a lot of questions.
So I'm going to ask you, Orlando, to address this really quickly, and then I'm going to come to you, Colette, to finish. The LAO came out with a report can you give us a synopsis of what the LAO's take was on this new model?
Great, yeah, happy to. When it was presented to the legislature, we found that as we saw it in print, the goals were reasonable. In there, it included reducing recidivism, improving the health and well-being of both the incarcerated and staff, and a few number of other things. However, we heard that is still in the process of being developed. The advisory board that it was tasked with this is going to be developing, so there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unknowns at the time when this was presented, that it was just hard to say whether this is a model that's viable for the future, and also to the extent that the San Quentin model of repurposing a building is the California model, that also raises concerns on the cost that it's going to have to repurpose buildings prison-wide. We have 33 of them, and that it does raise concerns for us if the California model is primarily repurposing a building at San Quentin. And so right now, as we understand it, the committee's still developing that, and it's hard to tell what some of the outcomes of those discussions might be.
I will invite you all to go to the LAO's website and read the report, which is pretty informative. And again, the LAO is nonpartisan, so you can trust their analysis. Colette, I want to end on you. One of the things that I've heard from people about the San Quentin model is that San Quentin is a place where there's no shortage of volunteers, there's no shortage of people who want to help. But when you get to more rural areas, it's harder to have programming. It's harder to have meaningful programming. You've been a volunteer. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I want to start by saying anything that is restorative, that is going to be brought into the incarceration system, I think is a bonus. San Quentin has more volunteers than it has employees. So they already have programming, and they do have a lack of space. There's no question, they do. We were asked to do our program more than once a week, but there's no space for it. And there's a lot of programs that have that problem. So remodeling some buildings and doing something like that, I think is great. I have heard there's a lot of pushback on spending the inordinate amount of money that they're going to spend when the CDCR does not give organizations that they don't give them funding. And yet organizations are supposed to be the backbone of this. So it's very difficult. Like there's an organization I belong to that has, I believe it's currently 73 smaller nonprofits like mine. And they are against this, not because of the premise. It's a fantastic thing. It's just that it seems to be infrastructure is driving it first. And what happens to the incarcerated while we're waiting? San Quentin has programs. It has a university. It has the things that are needed. But there are programs, like you said, that don't have anything. That the money should maybe start there, putting programs in place and just improving some of the structures that are already there.
This is a great discussion. We have to switch gears a little bit. We're going to go to how the public and incarcerated people define rehabilitation. If you watch the news, if you watch social media, people across California feel unsafe. And it's interesting because, a lot of Californians support laws that have really pushed back against mass incarceration and looking at it differently. But then in the same breath, people are, on the other fence or whatever. But I want to get your opinion. What does rehab mean for the regular, everyday Californian? And how do you speak to that? How do you talk about rehabilitation at the same rate when so many people feel unsafe? Jesse, I'll start with you.
Thank you. So I think there's like I live in East Oakland, and it's real. There are an increase in crimes, right? But you can't put like rehabilitation in the same category as current day crimes, because a lot of the folks that are going through these programs have been in for decades, and they haven't come home. They're coming home maybe 17 a month. So it's not like the incarcerated come home and after being rehabilitated, they go and commit these crimes. I think the question is, how do we apply rehabilitation to the context of our social structure right now, whether that's in schools, whether that's in our community-based organizations that are out there on the front lines trying to stop gang violence, gun violence, and things like that. And how do we get like the formerly incarcerated that are home already to be mentors in our communities, so that they can actually facilitate some of those programs that deal with, gun violence prevention and restorative justice in our communities. In terms of like the assumption of safety, let me just, clarify the fact that I believe safety is an assumption. We believe that we're safe. When you get in your car, there's the assumption that you're going to get home safe. You might get in a car accident. You might get hit by a big rig. You might get hit by a train. Like, there's a lot of things that can happen, but we don't live off of the premise that our lives are always in danger, our property is always in danger. We assume that we're safe. And a lot of times, especially if you're on social media, whether it's Nextdoor, Citizen app, if you got one of them things, those things will drive your stress level high, because all you see is nothing but crime, 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 crime. And it's like, it's not really like that. Yes, people do commit more crimes that we see in social media now, but we've also seen more police shootings. Are they more? No, they're just more widely known. And there's a huge difference between what you know now because of social media and accessibility to information versus what was before, when you were ignorant because you didn't read the newspaper. So it's like, a catch-22, right? We do have a growing awareness of crime, but maybe not so much an increase in it. But
I would say I'm going to push back on that a little bit, because, if my car has never been broken into, or if, I've never heard gunshots on my street, and then all of a sudden I hear gunshots on my street, I don't need data to tell me that that's different. And while incarcerated people are not necessarily, often are not the culprits, or recently released people are not typically the culprits. Now, this may be on the media. A lot of the backlash falls upon that, upon reentry, upon rehab, upon people who are paroled or on probation. And maybe that's a knee-jerk reaction. I think it is. But how do you have a conversation about that in a way that's meaningful, explaining to people that, the people who are getting the bad rap for this are not necessarily the offenders. It's just they're an easier target. And Dr. Richmond, you're nodding your head, so can you speak a little bit?
Sure. I mean, one important point was what Jesse already said, which is that even if you don't care about data, the objective data don't necessarily match in terms of crime patterns what the public perception is. But also, repeat your question. I'm sorry. The direct.
I was just asking, how do you have an honest conversation, even if the patterns don't match?
So I think the starting place is to point out that there are very different recidivism rates and very different attributes of different populations who are coming out of prison. There's the quote lifers, people who have an indeterminate sentence who go to a parole board, and the parole board is very exacting in figuring out, does this person pose a threat to public safety? Last year, the parole board, I think, paroled 17% of the people it saw. That's a very selective process. That's much different from someone who has a determinate sentence, probably for a lesser crime. That's maybe 10 years, and then the door swings open and you're out. Very different population. The lifer population, those with the longer sentences, typically hover in between 1% and 3% in California. 3% is the highest recidivism rate it's really ever been, actually. Whereas as you mentioned, the determinate sentence population right now is more around 45, 46%. And so you really have to be careful when you're making these broad generalizations about humans coming out of prison, who you're talking about in terms of the risks. Because someone like Jesse sitting next to me is way less likely to ever commit a crime again to my knowledge, than everyone else sitting in this room, including myself, because I've never been through that rigorous process.
You asked how would we address it. I get that challenge all the time, right? Not having a puppy program or, making people feel good. The reality is the majority of people who are in prison are going to come home. Do we want them to come home the way they went in? Or do we want them to come home as caring citizens who are going to live a life of living amends for the hurt and pain they caused? I think it's on all of us as society to invest in solid restorative programming that helps people come home and be incorporated into society and assist them in being successful and giving back. Because they're going to come home to a neighborhood near you, whether you believe it in or not. So isn't it best that we invest in that?
And I see some hands. We're going to have Q&A shortly. Orlando, do you have anything to add?
I think one thing that's important is also sharing the data and going back to what I provided as like a definition for rehabilitation. It's important how you measure it, and can you show people that some of these programs work, or can you show people that crime is being reduced? And that, I think we think that's an important piece of the conversation that shouldn't get overlooked, and a great way to have that conversation with people on what can the data show us, what can it not show us at this time, and how can we build towards that. That's a good starting point.
Jesse, I want to go back to you. You're someone who went through incarceration, rehabilitation to where you are now. If rehabilitation had gone the way you wanted it to go, maybe it did, maybe it didn't, what would it have looked like for you?
So there's a couple of things. Going into the system, there's no intake process, right? So when I came into the prison system, there was no, here's a pathway to reentry. So you get a couple life sentences, you go into the prison system, and I went in when it was just the CDC. It was California Department of Corrections. It wasn't rehabilitation. It was just, lock them up and figure it out on your own. The only programs that we had access to was NAAA and church and basic education. So there was no plan for us to actually ever come home, much less the tools that we needed to be successful when we came home. And then when I did get home, there wasn't the support systems that, I had been promised. So there was an expectation that like, I paroled to the Bay, there's going to be people dying to help me. And everybody who gave me their phone number didn't answer. No lie. Only 2 people responded, took me out to dinner, and then after that, I didn't see them. I kept a couple mentors, and that was about it. But if it would have been the way that I wanted to see it, right, I would make sure that people had, number one, a determinate hope. Because here's the thing, right? The way that the system is set up right now, when you go in with an indeterminate sentence, you don't have any hope of ever going home. And even if you do all the programs in the world inside of the prison system, there's no guarantee that the parole board would actually find you suitable, which is, a procedural, fault, right? Because if you produce, right, these incentives that, hey, here's our expectation, then I should be able to come to you, and if I check off all these boxes, then I should be found suitable. The assumption has always been inside the department that you're going to get enough services just to make you better, but not enough to get you home. And that's an error. I would want determinate hope for everybody so that they understand that, hey, we're going to go home. That's an incentive for them to program. Number 2, I would not only get education, but vocational training and the fastest pathway to employment. I need a pipeline to employment. I don't need you to train me. I have 4 masonry certificates, carpentry, melon cabinet, automotive repair. I don't work in none of those fields. Why did I get all that stuff? Just so that I could have it, to show that I was a good boy. But guess what? I need a pipeline to employment. And once I get out, I need some room to grow. No child grows when you're a helicopter parent. Nobody as a human being, a grown adult, grows with blackout periods or with parole officers lurking over their back. Let them roam, find a job, Give them the support that they need so that they can make the early mistakes of learning to acclimate to society that we took them out of. Because that's the whole thing. Society is not without excuse in this. We come out, with a lot of barriers and hurdles that are systemic, that are legal, that are still on the books, and we're trying to address every problem that we have. But you won't deal with the ones that you have on the books that are barring us from actually living like thriving, successful lives. So that's what I would want to see in the reentry rehabilitation process.
Okay, we're going to move to Q&A. Any of you have any burning questions? Oh, wow. Okay, we're going to start here. I saw her hand. She no, on the first row. Hold on, she's bringing you a microphone.
Thank you. You talk about a pipeline, and my question would be, how do you see that pipeline working? You talk about parole. Should parole include that while you're on parole, that there's a requirement that you enter into a program where you start to feel good about yourself? In other words, how is this implemented? What do we do when somebody's still in prison and is coming out to see that we go out to different employment centers and say, we've got somebody coming out, we want you to employ them? Is that something that you can do? Because if you're a parolee and you come to some place and say, well, I've got all these certificates, they're not going to hire you most of the time. So don't your departments have to do something to help people to make that transition because of the bias that we have against people coming out of prison?
Who wants to take that question?
Can I?
Yes, you can.
Our program not only is 18 to 24 months inside, where we do case management and work with people. What is it you want to do? What do you want to be? And then we do the ABC, any job, better job, career with them, planning. They come to our reentry house, and they can stay rent-free for 6 to 12 months. We help them get their any job. We help them go to college if that's what they want. We help them to go to truck driving school if that's what they want. We provide the service, the wraparound services that Jesse talked about, so they don't fall through the cracks.
And is that a program that is available to everyone who 24 months later is coming out?
Unfortunately, we only take our people because we don't have state money. We are all funded by raising money. We're a nonprofit that raises funds to do this. We've been doing it. I've been doing this work for 23 years. The House has been in action for 10 years. And to date, we have a 0 recidivism rate. But that's because even 15 years down the line, whatever, if they're in trouble, they can come back or they can be in touch. Some people are in touch every day.
Okay.
What can the state of California do to finance that?
What can they do? Maybe not spend so much money on buildings and improve the reentry services. I mean, like Dream Center does the best they can, but as Jesse said, there are problems getting reentry facilities in the right kind of environments because neighbors, not in my backyard, right? Money, how is it distributed? What are the services for? Parole does not give what people think they're going to get when they come out.
Doesn't the state of California have an obligation to do what you do for people?
So I'm going to let you two, you can have this conversation. We're going to move on to another question. There we go, second row, and then third and fourth.
Hi, Caitlin O'Neill with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Thank you to all the panel members. My question relates to the development of the California model and outcome metrics. And I think it's helpful to also note, because I think it gets lost in the conversation sometimes, is that CDCR was already, prior to the San Quentin proposal, was already embarking on pilot programs at 3 or 4 other prisons to pilot certain changes as a part of developing the California model, or what it's now calling the California model. And then we add on the what's being developed at San Quentin. So with all those different potential interventions being tested or in development, the state hasn't identified at this point specific outcomes that it's targeting, though it has, as has been noted, identified a wide number of potential goals like recidivism reduction, improving a variety of different potential wellness metrics. There's many different potential outcome metrics that could be targeted here and would inevitably likely require different types of interventions to achieve. So my question is, how should stakeholders hold the state accountable for achieving outcomes, or how can they when there haven't been outcomes identified? And so in particular, I'm thinking perhaps of someone who's either working or living right now, let's say in a Calipatria, RJD, an Ironwood. What do these pilot programs mean for them and in the future potentially, and what kind of metrics would you like to see come out, be set, or goals aside from building this building?
Okay, Jesse, will you answer that question?
Yeah, so I
Best
think
you can.
so. One of the things, right, that I like to think about is that this problem requires multiple solutions to solve, right? So within the California prison system, we're not just dealing with like planning a space for opportunity. There has to be like the programs, the incentives, and then you still have to deal with like the prison gangs, the politics, and everything else that's layered on top of that. Then you got staff culture, that you have to address, so you have to create like a supportive environment. So some of the metrics that I would look at, right, if I were the, like, let's say the strategic planner behind the thing, right? Number one, I would look at, like long term, like I'm looking at 2.5 years, 5 years, and 8 years, and I'm looking at how many people go through the program and actually end up employed and thriving. That's number one, right? Number two is I'm going to look at how many of these programs at San Quentin can we replicate somewhere else where we can count on volunteers, sustainability, and viability. Just because you can replicate something doesn't mean it makes sense to do it. Because if you don't have sustainability and viability, then you shouldn't do it. So that's number two. And then number three is that I would always ask for accountability. So one of the things that we've always had, right, is that I recognize accountability as a formerly incarcerated individual, and I recognize the importance of transparency in that process. Like I have to be open about what I've done, what my intentions are, where I'm going. But one of the things that we've always had within, and we always talk about the state or the department, and we have these entities, right, that we say we should hold accountable, but we rarely do because there's no transparency, right? There's no incentive for us to actually do it. Because the only time I'm realizing, as I read history, the only time that we hold the state accountable is when they try to invest in rehabilitation and reentry. We haven't done that when it's tough on crime laws.
So I hope this answered your question. We're going to we have one more question, and then we have to.
My name is Richard Morellis. I'm with the CROP Organization, Director of Outreach and Engagement, and co-founder. I was incarcerated for 21 years, and never got a write-up in prison, earned an AA, bachelor's, master's, came out in 21 years in there, never write-up. 4.5 years out here, never write-up. Co-founded a reentry organization, spoken at the Capitol multiple times, 100 legislative visits, could go on and on. But still this morning, parole agent comes to the house and passed my 73rd in a row alcohol and drug test of 8 panels. And so my question, I loved your article. My question is around, when I bring up the issue, why am I still on parole? Homeowner, make 6 figures. And I'm not saying that in a braggadocious way, but in a way to point out there are so many people that are doing things, and they say, well, you're still on because you missed 2 cognitive behavioral therapy classes, because that's how it's being measured right now. Those are the measurement outcomes right now. And then I think about the $100 million plus it's gone down the drain because the data and analytics are not being measured. At our organization, we are building a platform where that will always matter for funding. For long-term funding, you have to show the data, right? So are there any talks of that You know, I was listening to Orlando, and those types of outcomes that are being measured so that the state in the future is getting the biggest bang for their buck, right, in reentry with organizations that are going to show the data and analytics. And not only that, but with parole, having those conversations around, why isn't this person off? Homeowner, 6 figures, married, 4.5 years,
Right.
goes to work, goes to Oakland, you know, so.
So, Orlando, do you want to take that? Or Dr. Richmond?
Yeah, sure. I think I heard your question being, why are certain people still on parole despite showing some success? Is that, or
Or around the outcomes metrics,
Yeah.
is anything be considered to rethink them, reimagine them, because they don't seem to be the best approach.
right? And that's a conversation that needs to be had both with the administration, the legislature, and the department on how we can begin to rethink those some of those ways that better capture. I think historically this is a lot of what's done is because of what's been done historically. And what I want to emphasize is that if we begin collecting that data, start showing those outcomes, which are being done at a limited basis, we can begin to kind of start driving that conversation and forward and start investing in those programs that work for people.
All right, we're running out of time, but we're going to be on time with this last question. In one sentence, and I'm going to start with you, Dr. Richmond, what is one actionable thing the state can do today to make things better?
Compound sentence.
It can be a compound sentence. We're just running out of time.
Open universities in every prison in California, and parole reform. I've been in these conversations, and he's absolutely right. Put our resources where they're needed, not where they're wasted.
Colette?
In one sentence, it'd be impossible. We need transformation. We need change. So it's a good start. Like your investigation showed, there's no balance. There's no checks and balances for any of the reentry programs. Pre-release is great, but has to be followed with secure post-release. I mean, it's just everything that's been said today so far.
Orlando, your one sentence?
Tracking the programs that work.
And Jesse?
I would say something tangible would be solicit the public to be a part of the solution of addressing the systemic issues that continue to perpetuate incarceration in the first place.
Now, we've lost some people, but I want to end on this question. How many of you feel like you know better what rehabilitation means in California? Wow, those are more hands than we had. Thanks for attending. I'm going to turn it over to Neil.
Thank you all. And I love the show of hands, right? I know a lot of folks online probably feel the same way. One of the things I've noticed watching this event online from the back of the room, the online attendance usually drops off as you get into an event like this and go through. It did not change at all, did not drop a bit during this one. Very fascinating conversation. I fear we probably didn't give enough time. We could talk about this a lot more, and we certainly will. This is an ongoing area of inquiry for Baranda and for us at CalMatters. I want to thank you all very much for giving us the time today and for being here for the conversation. Again, a very special thanks to our friends at Lucas Public Affairs for hosting us, making this possible here today. We are a nonprofit news organization, right? We do this through one channel, which is the support from people who think what we do matters. There are a couple signs in the back. If you don't get our daily newsletter, I really encourage you to do that. There's a little QR code back there. You can sign up. If you're not a member, if you consider supporting us, if you're in a position to do that, your donations are what make this possible. You're going to see a lot more of this kind of event over the rest of this year and into next year. We'll be doing a festival here in June, Ideas Festival in Sacramento about some of these issues in California that are so important, and a lot more coming up in the next year, not to mention our coverage of the 2024 elections. So a lot for us to do. A lot to continue this conversation. Thank you all very much, And we'll see you again soon. Thank you.